Hello and good morning. Welcome to day 4 of the forced coronavirus shut-in. Of course, it's not a complete shut-in, and people are out on the streets. They're just trying to avoid crowds. So this is our anti-social social hour, if you will. So this is our third presentation for avionics.education.com. My name is Bruce Bissett. If you haven't been here before, please hit that subscribe button and don't forget to smash that notification bell to let you know when I put videos on the air. I've got time off for the next couple of weeks. They canceled the courses that I was scheduled to teach next week in Oklahoma City with the FAA. So I'm going to be doing some work for a previous contractor, and I'm going to be doing a lot of this conversion to online training. And of course, live web streaming will be how I start to facilitate the online courses. I don't think a complete course should be just, punch a button and take the course and take the test and move on. I like to be able to get in front of you, look you in the eye. Well, it's a single eye. Look you in the single eye and ask your questions. So I plan to begin a facilitation of an online course combined with a webinar section to allow for question and answers. As I said, I still love teaching live in front of people. I like the interaction with my students. I still want to keep doing that. But moving forward, you're all going to have to modify somehow, and this is my way to modify, is to take this online program. So today's topics, what are we going to talk about today? Well, I want to discuss aircraft quality parts, meaning that for us as technicians that are returning aircraft to service, and I'm only going to pick on type certificate aircraft, we'll identify what we mean by type certificated aircraft, and then our responsibilities to maintain these aircraft to some airlines to the highest level of quality and safety, or at least an airworthy standard. So we'll talk about that coming up in the next section. So one of the key elements that we all technicians have to do when we're working on aircraft is that when we go onto an aircraft and we need to replace a part, we have to verify that that part is in an airworthy condition and is safe, in addition to it being the proper part that goes on the aircraft. And that goes back to talking about airworthiness, the definition of airworthiness. And we're going to go ahead and cover that today, this morning. So where are we talking about? Bear with me here, people. I'm going to keep switching screens. There we go. So our objective for this presentation is going to be to provide maintenance technicians with an understanding of what an aircraft quality part is to be used for repair. We're going to talk about some guidance that the FAA has put out to determine that, and more importantly, we're going to discuss the rules that understand it. So first thing I'm going to do is that Part 43 is our maintenance rules. This is how we perform maintenance as technicians, whether you're a certificated repairman, an A&P mechanic, or somebody working under the supervision of a maintenance provider. Could be a repair station, could be an airline. We all have to comply with 4313. We'll talk about that. I want to identify the difference between a non-type certificated aircraft product and those that are, so that we have a complete understanding of what are we hanging these parts onto. And then we'll get into what the FAA wants to know, or wants you as a technician to have an understanding of when I install a part on an aircraft. So we're going to talk about the guidance that the FAA has put out, and the latest version is Advisory Circular 43.62 Echo. So let's hit right into it. I'm going to go right to FAR 43. Here are the rules. Performance rules, general, little a. And there's a lot here, but the first thing is each person performing. And it goes through all the lists on an aircraft engine, propeller, or appliance shall use the methods, techniques, and practices. And more importantly, that person shall use the tools, equipment, test apparatus necessary to assure completion of the work in accordance with accepted industry practices. And then we get back to special equipment. Remember this phrase later on in the presentation, because we're going to come back to test apparatus necessary to complete the work. In other words, to determine the airworthiness of the product to be installed on the aircraft. Little b, again, talking about each person maintaining or altering an aviation product, shall use, there's that word, if you've taken my FAR regulations course, words matter. Shall means imperative. You have to do it. Shall do that work in such a manner and use materials of such a quality that the condition of the airframe, aircraft, engine, propeller, appliance worked on will be at least equal to its original or properly altered condition. And it goes through all what they mean by properly altered condition. What this means in a nutshell is we must follow the information provided to us technicians on how to install a component and determine airworthiness. And these will all be based on the instructions for continuing airworthiness the manufacturer is going to provide for us when we perform maintenance on a type certificated product. Again, there's that word again. I want to emphasize little b, and use the materials of such quality. So how do we identify that? Meaning that we must use an approved part. So an approved part is defined as something that's been properly designed, meaning that it has, in the world of type certification products, our aircraft, means Part 21, properly produced, which means manufactured, again, that's under Part 21, then properly maintained, which means for us in maintenance, are we maintaining the product? Are we protecting it? Are we installing it correctly? And last and foremost, everything about anything we do in aviation, we must have documentation. We have an old saying in the FAA, if it isn't written down, it never happened. And that is documentation. And if you've seen one of my videos before on Ask an FAA Question or on YouTube, on the Avionics education, I did talk about serviceable pegs and return to service documents. So that'd be a good one to go to if you need more information on what documentation is. But what could happen if everything breaks down? And I'd like to discuss real briefly here some examples of where an aviation part did not meet any of the 4 criteria. And this was really the beginning, going back to I believe it was I'll pull it up here, 1989, where the Partnair aircraft, there's a Convair 580, which was the turboprop version, experienced a complete failure. In other words, we had an in-flight breakup of the aircraft. The investigation showed, and here's the problem, there was no flight data recorder for it, that at the area of the breakup, there was evidence of aerodynamic flutter, and which you could see in the aluminum skin, that the skin will overheat. Think about a hanger, remember the old-fashioned hangers, if you bend it back and forth numerous times, it eventually fracture. Well, that's because it'll increase its heat internally. They also found that APU mount had broken, which aggravated the vibrations. And they also found that the rudder shroud doors were missing before the breakup, which means that there was evidence that these shroud doors that cover where the bolts are that mount the rudder into position were missing before the aircraft broke apart. There was a flight data recording earlier which did show indication that the aircraft was experiencing of vibrations, possibly due to flutter at the time. And then looking back at Mantrax, when I investigate aircraft accidents, I look and see who worked on the aircraft. And the record showed that a mechanic did change all 4 of the vertical rudder bolts. For me, as an aircraft mechanic, that is what I would call unusual. It's not something you change all the time. So I would definitely be looking at that as an investigator. Well, what did they find out? It was discovered through the investigation that the 4 bolts and the sleeves that were used to hold the rudder into position as aircraft were counterfeited, meaning that they weren't treated, therefore would not remain torqued, which means they were too soft. And what aggravated the situation is you had the APU mount that was broken that allowed vibration in the back of the aircraft to set up these harmonics. So no one incident caused an accident, right? Now remember your accident investigation course when it talked about links in a chain. So what did this lead to? We had an indication to where we had a bogus part or an illegal part or an unairworthy part introduced into the system. So the FAA went through and did an audit of aircraft manufacturers, airlines, people that were certificated, repair stations in the U.S. Department of Transportation, and found that 39% of the parts on the shelf were found to be either counterfeit or otherwise what we define now as an unapproved part or a suspected unapproved part, meaning that they didn't meet the 4 criteria: properly maintained, properly manufactured, properly designed, or more importantly, did it have its documentation? If you can't prove the documentation, the part was not done. Moving on. There we go. So, moving forward today, and we're going back to 2010 right now, and we'll talk about in the SUPS course. I do have a SUPS course that actually is a 2-hour version of this course that talks about suspected unapproved parts. But since 2010, there were an investigation by the NTSB looking at aviation parts that played a role in aircraft accidents, going back to 2010. There were 24 that could be shown that an aircraft did have an unapproved part installed in the aircraft that was a factor leading to the aircraft. And this is difficult to find, especially even today with accidents being really low, but also the fact that a lot of the parts that fail in flight will disappear into the accident. Now, the FAA has recorded, just in the past 5 years, 135 unapproved parts that were discovered in passenger jets. And if you pull up the most recent one, there was a whistleblower from China that tagged parts that were installed on Boeing 737 slat actuators that were definitely unapproved parts and posed a hazard to aviation and had to be removed from the system. So it's still happening today. Why? because aviation parts, to meet those 4 criteria I talked about before, it necessarily makes them really expensive because of control, design, record keeping, all that goes with the proving an aviation part means that it costs money for technicians and manufacturers and aircraft manufacturers to track these parts. Which goes back to what this last bullet point is. The actual numbers can be 1,000 times more because of lack of reporting issues and the fact that many of the parts fail long before their scheduled time, but they don't lead to an accident. There were the trends. This is a chart that was produced under the original Suspected Unapproved program course that was taught many years ago when the program came out. This was taken in data that was produced in 1995 to 2000. And it's just asking a simple question. Where in the system are these, what we say, unapproved parts, which we can assume unsafe parts? So out of the list of those years, we had 37 we didn't know about, but we looked down the list. The highest number on that list are, first and foremost, repair stations. 145 repair stations either doing work for general aviation aircraft or performing work for the air carriers themselves. Interesting enough, the next highest number of reports were those that have a financial stake in selling parts, and those were the parts distributors themselves. They would get a batch of parts from a supplier, and they would find out that these parts were unapproved. They couldn't meet the 4 criteria I just talked about. So in interest to discourage suppliers from selling unapproved parts, they would do the reports. And then you move down the line, the mechanics themselves were 135. The air carriers was only 48. And that's not because of lack of oversight for air carrier operators, is that they rely on parts suppliers to verify and validate that the parts. However, in today's world of Consolidated Aircraft Safety Systems, CAS, the air carrier themselves are ultimately responsible for anything that's done on that aircraft, which includes the supplier supplying the part to distributor selling the part to the repair station, and repair station performing maintenance for the air carrier. Ultimately, it's the air carrier's responsibility that these parts are safe and approved. Now, there was a situation to where when the original Suspected Unapproved office was set up in the late 80s to early 90s, it was actually under AVR, which is the flight standards part of aviation. And for a reason, after 2002, the flight standards office closed the SUPS office and transferred the responsibility to the Aircraft Certification Service. Then they were responsible for the detection and reporting of unapproved parts. And we're going to talk about AC 2129 it's version E right now, in a moment. Going back to who? If you go through and look at the list that was on, I'm going to show my cursor here. Production holder is manufacturer, right? Everybody else is flight standards. So this is the only one that AIR really had authority to look at. But repair stations under flight standards, mechanics were under flight standards, air carriers were under flight standards. These were the lion's shares of the reporting back then. So what does that really mean, Bruce? Well, it should have not gone to AIR 600. It's my mind, in my opinion, just my opinion, because I'm not in the FAA, I can have an opinion. The AVR 20, it should go back to flight standards because that is the people who are most likely to catch these parts being installed on an aircraft. And we'll talk about that in another section. Okay, so since the AVR office, the Flight Standard Office, was closed, there has been a significant drop in the number of reporting of SUPs, Suspected Unapproved Parts. Remember, when I was in the FAA, when the program was under flight standards, an example for me is that I actually would get a notification through email at the time, or it'd be in other ways to the FAA inspector, and I'd be notified through the SUPS process to go investigate an unapproved part that was one of my operators, one of my air carriers that I was assigned principal for. And we go look and see if these parts were in inventory. And we pull them out. We found, for one operator, we found generator shear shafts that connect the generators to the CSDs were bogus. Another source of unapproved porting to me was directly from an operator. I had an Avionics operator who called me up, and they were doing a repair, and they opened it up, and the maintenance had been done out of country, and noticed a significant change to the battery system of an inertial reference unit, IRU. That turned out that we had to do an investigation because this outside the United States maintenance repair organization was not using approved data and using approved processes. So it became very good then. Now, what happened since? Well, the OIG, the Office of Inspector General for the DOT, did issue a report. They did an audit report. And I'm going to put this on the link on the description page in this video later on when I redo the video. And they were really critical of the FAA as a whole of not really having an established system for reporting or giving mechanics and technicians and airlines an avenue to report SUPs. We'll talk about that later. So then what? What are we supposed to do? Well, we're supposed to, as technicians, still operate, working on aircraft or maintaining aircraft in accordance to Part 43. So it's still us, our responsibility, to determine that the parts that we're using in the aircraft are appropriate and safe. Okay? Two issues here. Is it appropriate and is it safe? The FAA did issue guidance to help us do that. And we're going to talk about, this is detecting and reporting suspected unapproved parts. But I also have another one that talks about identification of aircraft parts. So there is orders there. Right now, this order, if you go to the AC, will tell you to go to the hotline and do a hotline complaint on the form. And so I'm confident that the FAA will step up and make improvements. So let's talk about 43.1, applicability. This is getting back to that properly maintained element of a part. And just paraphrasing here real quick, except as provided in paragraphs B and D of this section. Remember, these FARs always have exceptions, and these exceptions will cover other operators that have their own set of rules. This part describes rules governing the maintenance, preventive maintenance, rebuilding, and alteration of any, and it has three: aircraft having a U.S. airworthiness certificate, some foreign registered aircraft, and we'll talk about that in a second, or any airframe, aircraft engine, propeller, appliances, and component of such aircraft. So everything that meets an airworthiness standard has to be maintained in accordance with Part 43.1. So what does that mean? Well, let's talk about the first one. Aircraft that are operated in the United States under a TC type certification are issued at their inception and standard airworthiness certificate. And under the conditions of the certificate, unless sooner revoked or suspended, it says on that size, that the aircraft must be maintained in an airworthy condition for the certificate to be valid. So what's an airworthy condition? And we always have to talk about that. And the FAA has actually updated its definition, but it's actually both a verb and a noun in some sense. It's a condition of being and something that can be described. First and foremost, it is something that meets its type design. In other words, everything on it the day it was born, when the aircraft was hauled out of the factory and it was issued the airworthiness certificate. And then there's words, remember, my FAR class says, or in properly altered condition. And what they mean by properly altered is that not every aircraft is going to be perfectly replicated throughout its entire life as if the day it was issued its airworthiness certificate. It is modified over time. It's improved over time. These improvements or modification must be properly done. And we're talking about STCs, ADs, airworthiness directives, supplemental type certifications, or other types of modification of the aircraft over the year. Did you know properly altered condition could mean compliance with an MEL, minimum equipment list requirement? It can still mean that the aircraft is airworthy, with the caveat, it must at all times be in a safe condition for flight. And I won't get too much into the weeds on that definition, but it really just means that, for example, if I have a landing light out, the minimum equipment list says that I can have a certain number of my landing lights out and it be safe. The safe means, well, if I'm flying in daylight, in clear weather, then it's safe for me to have a landing light out. However, if the conditions of the weather is bad, or I'm at night in certain conditions, then even though the ML says I can deactivate the equipment, it may not be safe for me to do so. And that's what they mean by conditions for safe in flight. So let's talk about type design then. The conditions that an aircraft was issued its airworthiness certificate. Under Subpart B in Part 21, FAR Part 21 is manufacturing, issued by the FAA for type certification and included as part of the type design. We have all this information records. I've got operating limitations for the aircraft, type certificate data sheet for the aircraft. It talks about all the parts and capabilities of the aircraft. Applicable regulations of the subchapter, which FAA require, we read that carefully. The applicable regulations of the subchapter with which the FAA records compliance. What we're talking about there is that if I have an aircraft that's manufactured in a Part 21, there's a different subchapter for a Part 23 general aviation aircraft versus a Part 25 air carrier aircraft. That's what they mean. And there's the old caveats. Any other conditions or limitations prescribed for the product in this subchapter. So we're not going to get too much on that, but we're just talking about type certificates. What do they not include? Obviously, military aircraft. Military aircraft are made under their own military standards. Are they more or less strict than civil aviation? I would have to say no. But it's just another standard, another method of validation that we have to understand. I can't take a civil aviation part and mix it with a military aircraft unless the military specifications or maintenance structure says I can do so specifically. Experimental aircraft. There's a bunch of different types of experimental aircraft out there. Amateur home built. I don't maintain that to Part 43. It doesn't apply to an amateur because it's not type certificated. Special use experimental aircraft. Show compliance. The manufacturers, under the conditions of the certificate, determine the safety of the operation. And foreign manufactured aircraft. We operate in the United States. We allow a lot of aircraft that come into the United States that have foreign manufactured, meaning they're not U.S. and registered, operating under an air carrier certificate. We don't maintain them in Part 43. They have their own standards. So, aircraft with airworthiness, just by name, Boeing's, McDonnell Douglas, Bombardier's have airworthiness certificates. Cessna, Piper, any aircraft that is type certificated and has that white certificate. And if anybody gets on an airplane and are standing by the door waiting to get on, which is not happening, but when you walk in, you should see the airworthiness certificate somewhere posted around the entrance to the door. And with that being said, not only you talk about the aircraft manufacturer, but everything that goes on those aircraft must be maintained in accordance with Part 43. So let's talk about the next part of the situation. What is a qualified aircraft part? Well, the answer is one that meets an FAA parts approval process. And that has a lot of definitions in aviation because there's a few different people that can produce parts for an aircraft. For example, a manufacturer can produce their parts for their own aircraft. So design approvals for anything. And we talk about aircraft products, by the way. We'll get into this definition. A product is the aircraft itself, an aircraft engine, or a propeller. These are aircraft products. A part is eligible for installation in a type certificate product because we get back into, is it approved design? Has it been produced properly? And does it come with proper documentation? And this is for new parts, not repaired parts. So we're all complying with Part 21 here. Part of that approved design, these are things that have to be produced to it being a approved design, which means I need to have drawings, specifications, showing the configuration, and that means it may show the different approval levels or approval for what installation that the part can be installed on. Must include detailed and written test procedures and the desired results. In other words, if I have a test function for a pressure valve example, it wants to give the limitations. It must apply limitations to the technician certifying the part. At what point the valve opens? At what point does the valve close? That's what we're talking about, desired results. And the last is, it must define the airworthiness limitations included in a list of next higher assemblies for an aircraft for which the part is designed. So that must be all part of the approved design. The documents themselves, again, if it's manufactured by an aircraft, their document is going to be the type certificate sheet itself. I can approve aircraft parts based on an STC, stands for Supplemental Type Certificate. In other words, I want to make a widget for a Piper, for example. Then I can apply as an STC applicant, make the widget for the Piper, and then if I meet certain criteria, which is all the Part 21 criteria except for that one individual part on that one aircraft, the FAA will issue me an STC. Now, great, I can install it, but remember, there's something that has to go with it. If I want to sell the part, then I have to have a PMA, which stands for Parts Manufacturing Authority. So if I have an STC part and I want to manufacture it for sale, either on behalf of the TC holder or an STC holder, I must have a PMA approval to manufacture that part from the FAA. And Part 21 goes with all of that. So, type certificate holder can manufacture any part for their own aircraft, or they can allow other manufacturers to make those parts provided that they have a PMA letter from the FAA saying they can do that. So, how do we determine what parts can go on an aircraft? We're looking for an approved parts list. And this comes, again, in many various forms. For general aviation, when I went to A&P school, or when I taught in A&P school, the one that we went in the most was the Type Certificated Data Sheet, the TC Data Sheet. The TC Data Sheet provides information about the dimensions, what engines can be installed, what autopilots can be installed, the motion of the flight controls. It gives all the vital data for that aircraft to identify that as that aircraft. So, and there's an example here showing some of the equipment that could be installed by make, model, series, part number. Another item that will actually help a technician to determine if a part is legal is the aircraft's approved equipment list. Now, if it's not shown on the type certificated data sheet, the aircraft approved equipment list will show what is in the aircraft now and possibly what is an option. And the type certificate data sheet could show an autopilot make model, but maybe a later date that autopilot was modified to a newer unit, which means that the installer had to add to the aircraft's approved equipment list the new autopilot being installed, because it was installed using proper parts with proper data, using proper tools and equipment to install and test it. If you have an illustrated parts catalog, an IPC, that will also show you what parts are eligible to be installed by component. So IPCs themselves are not part of instructions for continuing airworthiness. They're not maintenance instructions, but a lot of technicians can use them as a tool that will show the orientation of certain parts as you installed it in there. But you certainly could use it to order the parts from an approved vendor. Okay, and here's another example of a component maintenance manual, and it shows the part number and its various installations and the figure numbers of where these parts are located. Another source of approved data is the FAA can issue an airworthiness directive. Airworthiness directives may require a change or an addition or a modification to a part involving into an aircraft involving aircraft parts. Even before the manufacturer has a chance to update the type certificate data sheet, the aircraft's approved list, the TC list, a mechanic can use an airworthiness directive as approved data to validate parts that are installed in an aircraft. So that's one way we can do it. And service bulletins the same way. A manufacturer can issue a service bulletin that will also be used as approved parts list. And so let's talk about determining the eligibility of a part. So, aircraft parts. Okay, now before anybody can return an aircraft to service, those parts and materials that are used to return an aircraft to service after repair, maintenance, or otherwise servicing must conform to the certification standards of the product being altered, meaning or altered or repaired. We're talking about, again, type certificated product, airframe, power plant, or propeller, or any part thereof, excuse me. Now, the FAA has an advisory circular that helps us all know and identify what these parts are. And that is Advisory Circular 20-62 echoes the most recent version as of this date. And it's titled Eligibility, Quality, and Identification of Aeronautical Replacement Parts. So in every advisory circular, everybody should be familiar with them, who works in aviation will have a paragraph that tells you exactly what this advisory circular is for in the first section. Under purpose, this advisory circular provides information and guidance for use in determining the quality, eligibility, and traceability of aeronautical parts and materials intended for installation on U.S. type certificated products and to enable compliance with the applicable regulations. And one word I want to highlight here is traceability. Traceability is only done through documentation. And we'll talk about that here in a second. So what is an acceptable part? Under the definition, acceptable part can be a standard part. We'll talk about that here in a second. Standard parts, nuts, bolts, rivets, anything that's established by U.S. industry. A part produced by an owner or operator for maintaining or altering their own product, for which are shown to conform with FAA-approved data, and parts for which inspections and tests have been accomplished by an appropriately certificated persons authorized to determine the conformity to FAA-approved design data. Okay, and we'll talk about each of these subjects separately. Another thing we'll talk about is a commercial part, and we'll cover that here real quick in a second. But next, we need to talk about acceptable parts. The following parts may be found to be acceptable for installation in a type certificated product. Parts fabricated by an appropriately certificated holder with a quality system and consumed in the repair or alteration of a product or article in accordance with Part 43. What are we talking about here? Part 43, maintaining, means that I can manufacture a part provided I'm either an airline or a repair station or somebody who holds PMA. And I have to be careful here because a manufacturer cannot repair. A manufacturer who holds PMA can overhaul a part. We'll talk about that in a second. There's a distinction there when we talk about words. What that means that these people can manufacture as long as I have the data, the tools and equipment, and the trained, qualified personnel to do the work. Again, an article I wanted to talk about before, the definition. If a product is an aircraft engine, propeller, then an article is everything else. It means a material part, component, process, or appliance. There's that commercial part identified. An article that's listed on an FAA-approved commercial parts list included in the design approvals holders instructions for continued airworthiness in accordance with 21.5. Remember we talked about Part 21 talked about subchapters. This is one where it talks about the manufacturers having to comply with the subchapters of their type of products, whether it's general aviation, small aircraft, large aircraft, etc. So let's get back to what parts are. What is a standard part? Well, that is a recognized aviation part that is that meets a known specification and can be traced back to its manufacturer of origin, which means it gets back to documentation. A good one are AN, stands for Air Force Navy bolts, or MS, military standard bolts and hardware. If you're an A&P mechanic or work for a distributor of these parts are specifically marked to identify them as meeting that criteria. But that is a standard part. Nuts, bolts, cotter keys, cotter pins, rivets, the standard things. Now, there are bolts that are specially treated. For example, the rudder bolts on the conveyor. Those are not standard hardware. Those are hardware that were specifically designed, which means they will have identifying marks outside of these standard marks shown here. What is a new part? And that is a product, accessory part, or material that has no operating times or cycle. Now, there are situations, particularly in the manufacturing process, when a part may have cycles or times recorded on them, and sometimes they don't. For example, when an aircraft goes through manufacturing, there's a certain period of time where it's gone through testing and proving flights. Well, these are part of the manufacturing process and not included in the lifetime of an aviation part. So aircraft parts, particularly life-limited parts, don't start accruing time until after the date that the airworthiness certificate is issued. Even though they may have a number of cycles on it, they don't count. And that's part of the manufacturing process. Manufacturers build that into the manufacturing process. Notice that they're going to be doing test flights, or for our example, we used to have down here in southern Arizona, aircraft were manufactured built up in Wichita, and were literally flown here for completion as part of the manufacturing process. Overhaul, there we go, define an overhaul. If I can define a part as overhaul, it means airframe, aircraft engine, propeller, everything else, using techniques, practices acceptable to the administrator, which has gone under the following. Now, keyword, acceptable to the administrator, what are they looking for? They're looking for approved processes, using approved tools and equipment, using acceptable parts and materials. And they must have undergone, completely be disassembled, all right? And not torn down to you have to do rivets, but disassembled as much as possible, inspected, and reassembled. And this back to like new tolerances. They must be tested in accordance to new tolerances, as if it was new, and been returned to service using documentation. Can an overhaul part ever be described as new? No. But it can have new life limits reset to 0 on it under overhaul. Now, rebuilt is a different description too. Again, goes back and describes aircraft engines, so on and so forth, used part, new or used part that conformed to new tolerances and limits, to approved oversize or undersized dimensions that has undergone the following. Same as before. It's been disassembled, cleaned, inspected, repaired as necessary, and reassembled to the extent possible. And then the last part, it must be tested to the same tolerance and limit as a new item. And this is something that a manufacturer is allowed to do to their product. They can rebuild. However, they can't do anything else unless they have a repair station certificate. And then we get back to records. What records must be included with all these parts? Well, person approving or disapproving a return to service of a type certificated product must ensure that the required maintenance record entries comply with 43 FC 14 Code of Federal Regulation Part 43, and it must include the following information. What was done to it? A type of inspection, if it was an inspection. A brief description. Brief description could be changed tire. Brief description could be changed tire in accordance with maintenance manual. The extent of the either inspection or maintenance. The date that it was completed. If the aircraft or product has production hours, cycles, or life limits, that must be recorded as part of the return to service. Then it must have the signature, certificate number, and kind of certificate held by the person doing the actual approving or disapproving for a return to service. And it must state, have this term, and you've seen this in work orders and tags, the appropriate certifying statement that the product or part thereof is approved or disapproved for return to service as applicable. So we're looking for traceability back to this process if the part was returned to service, not new. So let's finish up here. The approval for return to service is the responsibility of the person who performs the maintenance and who signs the record for approval for return to service. Now, real quick side note here. Anybody could work under the supervision of a certificated individual and be non-certificated. But when we look at 43.9, return to service after maintenance, and not 43.11, 43.11 is an inspection. Only a certificated individual can perform inspections, but maintenance can be done by uncertificated people under supervision. But remember, the name of that person producing that uncertificated maintenance must be included in the record. Okay, the owner-operator ultimately is responsible for the continued airworthiness of the aircraft. Could be the airline, could be the registered owner. So they're the ones that are required to understand the airworthiness definition for the aircraft. Okay, we have to ensure that ensure that anything we perform and put on aircraft ensures continued safety in civil aviation, which means with that, it is essential that appropriate data be used when inspecting, testing, and determining the acceptability of all parts and material that we use for repair or manufacture. Which gives us back to our next point. Particular caution should be exercised when the origin of the parts, materials, and appliances cannot be established, or when their origin is in doubt. So, let me go to another slide here. So that ends the show or this presentation today. Now, this is part of an opening section of a larger training course that I have on my Thinkific page, and you'll be able to see it in the description on both recognizing this part here that you saw, recognizing aircraft approved parts and data, and it takes us to the next segment of dealing with suspected unapproved parts by definition. And if you're interested in getting that training, you could go to my Thinkific site and sign up for the course. I'll have the introduction published by the end of the day. And the beauty of this course is that it can be used if you're an airline, if you're a repair station manager, or if you just want to know as a technician working on your own what your responsibilities are for maintaining aircraft in a safe condition. I've also will include as part of the training a downloaded synopsis which describes the curricula, the regulations involved that can be included in your approved training program curriculum. My second life, that's one of my expertise is that I am a repair station expert, subject matter expert, but I like to focus in on repair station training programs, which means I could help you develop a manual. I could help you establish a curriculum based on what the repair station or airline needs to achieve. And I could also help you get those manuals approved with the FAA as far as telling you what the FAA is looking for when it comes to your training program. Remember, training programs are approved as opposed to the rest of the manual systems are qualified. So thank you for tuning in today. I hope everybody stays home, stays safe, and stays healthy. Remember, if you like this, if you didn't like this, if you just saw this, please put a comment down below and just say, hi, I saw it. And it gives me an idea of if I'm reaching individuals and if it's becoming helpful to you. I'm also looking to fill more programs and slides in the future, so please, by all means, give me a suggestion. Within an hour confine, what do you want me to talk to you about when it comes to aircraft maintenance? It could be regulatory, FAA regulatory. I could talk to you about a systems class, or I could talk to you about maintenance, repair station, or airline maintenance. So with that being said, thank you for spending time with me today, and we'll see you tomorrow morning, same time, same channel. Oop, still here.